Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Others are joining us soon. Jeff, Shane, Nate. All right, Hassan, here it comes. All right, here we are. Our session 9, I believe. Yes. 13th principle of section 1. We're almost done with this. Next week, we're going to finish this first section 1. So let's crack it because this is going to be a little bit of a long read. So number 13. Principle deriving from the source of illumination concerning the continuous origination of the world. The whole world originates in time, since everything in it is preceded in its being by non-existence in time. And everything in it is constantly renewed in its being, in the sense that there's absolutely no ipsiety or individual, be it celestial or elemental, simple or composite, substance or accident, but that its non-existence precedes its being in time, and its being likewise precedes its non-existence in time. In general, every body and every bodily thing whose being is in any way connected with matter is constantly renewed in its ipsiety and impermanent in its being and its individuality. There's a proof of this that appeared to us from God through reflection on several verses of his precious book, such as the saying, verily they are in confusion concerning a renewed creation, Khalqa Jadid, and is saying, and we are not to be forestalled in that we will exchange your likeness and recreate you in what you will not know. And is saying, and you see the mountains, considering them solid, but they are passing by like the floating of clouds. These and other verses allude to the ceaseless renewal and passing away of his material world and indicate its transience and finitude, as in his saying, everyone who is on it is passing away, but there remains the face of your Lord. He is of majesty and glory, or possessed of majesty and glory. And is saying, and the heavens are rolled up in his right hand, and is saying, if he wishes, he will take you away and bring you into a new creation. Khalqa Jadid again. And is saying, verily we shall inherit the earth and those who are upon it, and to us they shall be returned. This proof is taken from the establishment of the continuous renewal of nature, meaning universal nature, which is a substantial form pervading every body and is the immediate principle of its motion and rest. There is no body that does not have this substantial formal nature pervading the entirety of its parts. It is the immediate principle of each body's natural tendency towards a particular motion, whether it be in potency or in actuality, circular or straight, and if straight, toward or away from the center of the earth. It is forever changing and transforming and flowing into particular forms according to the substance of its essence. Its essential motion of being by giving being to all substance is the source of all motions in the accidents of place and position, and all changes in those of quantity and quality. It is through this universal motion or transubstantiation of being that the eternal is connected to that which originates in time, not through any of the other accidental motions, such as the rotation of the heavenly spheres, as in the prevailing cosmological theories. This is Mulla Sadra's extremely unique reworking, complete reworking of the Aristotelian notion of entelekia, or the enteleki. The way I have kind of rephrased this is that what we have is that in every substance, on all substance, in all universal substance, we have a presential inherence of the divine in it, right? It is what that makes that substance at every point move from point A to B and beyond, transform, all of that stuff. There is a presential inherence within substance itself. And this is an extremely radical reworking of the Aristotelian notion of the enteleki. He says, for the ipsiety of this nature is such that it is ceaselessly being renewed and passing away, originating and ending. There is no cause other than God for its continual origination and renewal, since what is essential in something is not caused by anything but its own essence. And the maker, when he made the essence of nature, made its essence to be continually renewed. This continual renewal is not made or acted upon or influenced by anything other than God. This is exactly like what the philosophers said concerning time when they said that its ipseity was by essence such that it was continually being renewed, lapsing, and flowing. Except that we say that time, instead of having an independent reality, is the measure of this continual renewal and transformation, which is another way of Plato's dictum of time being the moving image of eternity. The meaning of motion in the real and primary sense in this continual renewal of the state of being of a thing. Let me read that again. The meaning of motion in the real and primary sense is this continual renewal of the state of being of a thing. The thing's emergence and gradual passage from potency to actuality, which is commonly called motion, is only a relative, derivative, abstract motion in the mind. For motion in the primary sense is precisely the continual renewal of the being or substance of each thing. The above-mentioned emergence of something from potency to actuality is not that true substantial motion through which each being is continually renewed and thereby emerges from potency to actuality. The difference between these two meanings of motion is like the difference between being in the sense of the derivative abstract concept, which is one of the secondary intelligibles in the mind, and being in the sense of that reality through which a thing actually comes to be and is kept from non-existence. In sum, that through which something emerges from potency into actuality is always the concrete individual making this passage, in whatever category the motion may be, just as it may be in quality or in quality of one of the other categories of accidents. So likewise, it can be motion in its formal and material substance, as that is gradually transformed in its ipseity, not in its quiddity, with the continual renewal of its being. Okay, so this not just applies to any particular thing, shay, this will also apply to events, or developments of anything, anyway, that's a different conversation. The proof that this nature of corporality is a substance whose being is perpetually flowing, continually renewed in its very essence and ipseity, is mentioned in a detailed and elaborate manner in our book, Al-Asfar al-Arba, the Four Journeys, and in a separate treatise. There we have recorded the agreement of the most ancient philosophers concerning the transience and passing away of the world and the continual renewal of everything composed of matter and form, that every individual among the natural bodies, be it celestial or of the four sublunary elements, originates in time, which is also another way of talking about Ibn Arabi's perpetual creation. As for the natural universal, we maintain that it does not actually exist by its very essence, which is the well-known opinion of the philosophers, but rather by accident, a position opposed to by most of the theologians who deny it any existence at all. For the natural universal, by which I mean the quiddity, considered without any condition of whether or not it exists in a particular actual being, is neither eternal nor originated taken by itself. And I think it was in the chapter of Idris of the Bezels of Wisdom where Ibn Arabi outright says that the immutable archetypal essences have not even whiffed from the taste of existence. This is what this means, what Mulla Sadra just told us. Rather, its origination follows from the origination of its concrete individual instances, and its eternity likewise follows from their eternity. For taken simply by itself, it is not a particular individual thing which actually has being, because it is a relation, rather. So by itself, it has no subsistence, even if all of its particular instances should come to exist. Indeed, it has no substance, whether by essence or accidentally, except as a noetic form in God's knowledge, may he be exalted. Essentially what Ibn Arabi told us about the reality of the immutable archetypal essences. Now, as for souls, qua souls, that is insofar as they are connected with bodies, not in their noetic and purely immaterial aspect, their beings too are constantly being transformed and originating. Or their status is the same as everything else naturally embodied in matter, since the modality of their being is one of connection with a body. And that being, which is in connection with the body, is transformed along with the transformation of the bodies that are connected with it. So the soul, as long as it is merely a soul, is unified with the body in its lower and less significant side, which is that of material nature. This is, again, a gloss and a very radical reformulation of the Aristotelian entelechia, the entelechia of the soul. But it also has potential. It also has potentially an intellective aspect and a loftier side, which each should emerge from potency into actuality, can become pure intellect, which is the form of its species. And as for the absolutely separate intellect, aql mujarrad, and the immaterial forms, we must say something else than the usual theories of the philosophers, namely, what is perceived by the inner knowing of the true Unitarians, who unveil the inner reality and transcendent unity of being. It is that these intelligible forms do not have any being in themselves, and their essences are submerged and obliterated in the sea of unicity of the divine essence or being. They are the forms of what is in God's knowledge, may he be exalted, and the veils of godhood and the pavilions of his grandeur. Were it not for these luminous veils, the splendors of his countenance would have completely consumed and flamed everything the heavens and the earth, as is reported in the prophetic tradition. He, glory be to him, has divine modes and luminous ranks that are not among the particular things of this material world, and are not included in what is other than God. May he be exalted, since they are forms in the divine decree and in the world of divine lordship. These forms are the ecstatic angels, and that Quranic citation is wrong because that's not what that Quranic citation says. These forms are the ecstatic angels, al-mala'ik al-muhayyim, who have never regarded their own essences, being oblivious to them in their absorption in God, and whose own identities are dissolved in their being intellective rays and luminous effulgences of that first light, subsisting through its self-subsistence, not through its act of giving subsistence to contingent beings. This treasure cannot possibly contain the full exposition of this difficult and noble subject. Our intention here has been to indicate the continual origination of bodies and their forms and powers. As for the intellect, we have not affirmed its being as something other than God, and hence originated, and the theologians denied it. Thus, there is no need for us to discuss the manner of its origination, as many philosophers have done. This was the 13th section, the longest section of this first part. Now the floor is open to all of you to discuss whatever you guys want to discuss about what we just read. Go for it, whoever wants to go first. Just jump in. Hello.
Hey Wahid, excuse me.
No problem.
That last part there where he's talking about the theologians denying the premise he's talking about, does he have particular people in mind that you know of?
Probably the Asherites to some extent, but also some of the Shiite Mutazilites would also as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, my cup. Would any of his so on this point of disagreement, considering like the imamate itself, would that also extend to his beef with the contemporary Shia clerics of his time?
In so far, in terms of what we just read, you mean, or
Yes, in terms of what we just read.
yeah, I guess I don't. But can you explain how you derive that argument from what we just?
No, this is just like because from what I understand about Mulla Sadra is that he didn't just have a problem with the legalistic Sunnis of his time, but with the legalistic Shias of his time as well. So I was wondering on his views of this sort of pervasion of nature, how it would relate to imamate itself, and to.
That is a long discussion, but
I imagine.
let me try to simplify it. Mullah Sadra's notion of imamate is very complicated because on several issues he deliberately dissimulates, because this was such a thorny issue even in his own Safavid period, because this was, you got to remember, this was the period when the state was officially imposing 12 Shiism as a state ideology. And the mullahs that they imported from Lebanon and Iraq were just given a free rein. They were like Elon Musk under Trump, you know, cutting Iranian society at the time of anything that on the level of the state, that anything that was contrary to the America or Iran first or Safavid first agenda of that time. So Mulla Sadra's notion of the imamate, and especially the hidden imam, I will go out on a limb and say that it is in many ways a kind of a proto-Sheikhi notion of the hidden imam. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, but I think on the surface, Korban is correct when he says that the Sheikhi school doesn't believe in a literal parousia of the imam, that the parousia of the imam actually occurs at the end of time for each believer on a kind of a psychological or pneumatic or noetic basis, right? You could also read the contrary into the Sheikhi notion of the imam of the time. But with Mulla Sadra, this is essentially sort of, when you read between the lines of what he's saying throughout his works, this is basically also what he's saying. So he doesn't, it would be very difficult to pin him down on a belief in a literal eschatological unfolding in time, the end of the world, the coming of the imam, and you know, the kind of apocalyptic stuff that normal believers would expect by such an occurrence. So, but like I said, he is very careful to shroud those actual beliefs. You know, he does it less so than his teacher Mir Dalmad, who just, you know, basically prevaricates in a very dense and intellectual manner on this specific point as well. It's almost impenetrable trying to figure out what Mir Dalmad actually believed about this specific issue. But Mulla Sadra is basically also on that same page. So the encounter with the imam for Mulla Sadra becomes much like the Sheikhi, or at least the Orthodox Sheikhi view of being a kind of a personal noetic encounter. And so on the face of things, prima facie, the establishment would have a lot of problems with Mulla Sadra on that specific issue.
Okay, I see. Thank you. That's a
Yeah.
very good answer.
Anyone else?
I just want to say on that point, you have the equivalent in the other Abrahamic traditions too, Judaism and Christianity, with the Jewish Mashiach or whatever, and the Christian second coming of Christ. It's for me, and I don't want to say too much or reveal too much, but I think we can probably draw parallels there between the imamate and the hidden imam, and the hidden Christ and the second coming, and the Jewish notion of the same idea. For me, we're talking about the same thing, only from through a different lens.
Yeah, no, that's that's 100% correct. With Mulla Sadra, one thing that we got to remember is that Mulla Sadra was also a student of Mir Fendersky, who was a polymath in his own right, and the Illuminationist philosopher, but primarily a scholar of comparative languages and religions. So Mir Fendersky had traveled quite extensively to India and knew Sanskrit, knew some of the other local languages of India, had pored over text, had actually translated several yoga texts from Sanskrit into Persian. And for someone of his polymathic structure like Mir Fendersky, he obviously knew that this doctrine of eschatology and Perugia and the coming of the Avatar, Kalki Avatar, all of these occur in various iterations in all of these various traditions. And so to someone like Mirek Fendereski, the literal belief in this sort of a narrative poses a lot of problematic things, because it is also occurring verbatim in all of these other traditions, right? So what would be the resolution? Well, one of the resolutions that this particular tradition affected, beginning with Mulla Sadra, was precisely what I just said, where, the encounter with the Christ, the Perugia of the Christ, all of these various eschatological events become then very subjective and personal experiences, rather than literally erupting into the world. The other resolution is the resolution that was affected by the Babis, and in a very novel way, with the same presuppositions intact, is that the end of the world does not mean the end of the literal world, but it means the end of the literal dispensation, and that every resurrection denotes basically the coming of the Imam for each age, who just basically abrogates the previous dispensation altogether, and institutes a new dispensation. Then he in turn has a dispensation which is then abrogated by an Imam that comes sometime in the future ad nauseum, such that then even the concept of the finality of the Prophet in Islam becomes merely the finality and seal of that station within that specific dispensation, not for all time, and this was basically a reformulation based on the very same proposition and suppositions that the Sadrians and the Shaykhis and this entire tradition before it had, and the Ismailis, who had a very verbatim concept of this already within their own teachings. Yeah. Because if we take this stuff too literally, it is a veil. I mean, you see this in almost every religious tradition, where prophecies are basically taken as the clincher, the benchmark for the belief of any event, right? Such that the believer is not so much fixated on God, not fixated on the first God, but on these secondary intelligibles, for lack of a better word, in the form of the prophecies of the scripture. And when these prophecies are taken literally, they create innumerable problems, as we see. I mean, they're the literal breeding ground of all kinds of fundamentalist and straitjacketed views, etc., etc. Whereas, a God that is being itself cannot be predictable on that level. It can produce anything at any time, every contrary or every iteration of something at any time, which is why in Shiism in particular, we have this concept known as al-bada, the alteration of the divine plans, where it's written quite extensively. We have a lot of hadith from the Imams about this, where God can at any time, at any moment, whenever it wants, and whatever mode it wants, and can change anything from one to the other. Just redirect something into something else completely. And so this principle would ostensibly, on the words of the Imams themselves, even apply to the prophecies that people hold as sacred cows within their own tradition, whether this be Shiism or other elements of Islamic eschatology that are non-Shiite, never mind all the other traditions. And this is for the reason is that, God is the possessor of everything, including all the narratives. And by the same token, God transcends all the narratives. So the reality of God is even beyond what the scriptures are saying. The scriptures are a creative element of the Godhead. They're not the Godhead itself, which then basically, in one sense, refutes this concept that you found in the Abbasid period with some of these Sunni theologians about the eternity of the Quran with God. So from the Shiite, the esoteric perspective, even the Quran is a created thing, and God even transcends the Quran and the words of the Quran. Okay? And that is al-bada. It is capable of altering and doing whatever it wants, whenever it wants. Right? It's the master of being. On the level of eschatology in Islam, when we go back and really do a proper historical study and reverse engineering of the origin of a lot of these doctrines outside of the Quran, one example, I've talked about this before publicly. For example, this idea that Jesus returns with the Mahdi is a completely self-generated concept by the Sunnis in the middle of the Abbasid period. You will find no evidence of this in any of either the scriptural corpus or the Hadith corpus before the Abbasid period. And this arose from a very particular thing, because you had the Shiites and the various, Qullat sects that derived from the Shiites having this concept of the Mahdi or the Messiah emerging from the family of the Prophet. In a way to counter these narratives, right? Some of these Sunni theologians basically fabricated out of thin air traditions, claiming that at the end of time, the Mahdi would come as Jesus. And then it gets really interesting because over a few generations after these narratives were introduced into mainstream Islam, you also have Shiites suddenly out of the blue appropriating these same narratives, whereby then the 12th Imam and Mahdi is supposed to come back with Jesus. Whereas if you look at some of the earliest Shiite corpus of Hadith, for example, Numani's Kitab al-Ghaiba, no such idea about the return of Jesus alongside the Mahdi is even articulate. Nor does this make any sense from a pristine Shiite esoteric conception, for a very simple reason, is because from that original pristine Shiite conception, Muhammad and the Ahl Bayt are the return of all the prophets. They're not separate from them. These other prophets that have gone, their essences are the same as that of Muhammad and then his progeny in the Ahl Bayt. So this whole narrative that emerges even within Shiism that was generated by the Sunnis of the 12th Imam coming back with Jesus just is metaphysical gobbledygook. It makes no sense from either a metaphysical point of view or from the greater theological point of view based on the earliest doctrines.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Jeff.
That's all right. I just wanted to, if you don't mind, I just wanted to say one more thing right quick. My favorite sentence in this whole section, I just want to read it out loud for a sec, because I think it's very, apropos of what we're talking about right now. And just this one sentence: they are the forms of what is in God's knowledge, may he be exalted, and the veils of godhood and the pavilions of his grandeur. So just wanted to point that out. That's a very that apropos statement there. It's interesting because the forms are the veils, right? So anyway, that's all I wanted to spit out there. Please go ahead.
Just as a footnote, one of the titles of the imams, or the imam in the singular, if you want, is that the imam is God's veil of light. So
okay.
Yeah.
Say that again. The imam is God's.
The imam, or even the prophet, the man God, the complete human, is God's veil of light.
Veil of light, right? Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah. Nate.
Yeah, I thank you for expounding on that, because I did not realize that had been a sort of a fabricated eschatological tradition.
Yeah.
It never really made sense to me intuitively either. So I feel sort of vindicated that you just said that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, too, we're talking about very different visions of what the imamate is and what the kind of authority of the imamate is when you get from what the exoteric scholars are teaching to a more botany level, where you have that individual personal noetic encounter with the imam. And the imam could be refracted through billions of different lenses in that paradigm.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard to build a theocracy upon that rock.
It becomes an impossibility to build anything even resembling a theocracy on that sort of rock.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And even including with the concept of bada, the alteration of plans, this even makes the institution of clergy redundant, because how could they possibly know what the will of God at any moment is when it's constantly altering from one moment to the next?
Right. It seems more honest to leave room for God to exercise bada.
Exactly. And by the way, these are all in the Shiite corpus of Hadith that are accepted by these same clergy to this very day.
I've seen some Shia ulama have some very creative interpretations of ayat of the Quran and hadith when they want to defend a position that's very dear to them.
I know. Same story through the ages. Yep.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Anyone else? Hussein, Shane, Hassan?
Yeah, just wanted to say that in the Quran, there's an ayah that says um, the original Muslims or companions are the best of humans that have ever arisen on the earth. However, if their descendants are not, don't keep the faith, don't keep that tradition, then Allah will raise up another people to replace them.
Do you remember the verse? Because the wording
No.
is a little bit off. Yeah.
So I mean, even in the Quran, it sort of says that Muslims and Islam's not permanent.
Well, I mean, every verse in the Quran that speaks about a new creation, by definition, negates the possibility of the eternality of Orthodox exoteric Islam. And the theologian and the scriptural exegetes have always denied this, but the implication is very straightforward and categorical when put against the other verses in the Quran. This is a real sacred cow in Quranic interpretation, and it's been that way since the book was codified. And so the only conclusion that one can reach is that, the obvious apparent interpretation of this verse, of such verses in the Quran, in juxtaposition with the other verses of the Quran, is one of those red lines that if anybody crosses, then they bring the ire of the establishment, which then tells you a lot of other things. Yeah. But it only makes, the Quran itself is even saying this stuff. It's being very unequivocal. And when you even read the verse about, Muhammad saying, I'm not, a father of any of you, but I'm the seal of the prophets. The seal of the prophets in that particular verse has no implication of the finality of any revelation for all time, right? So, and seal, and there's been so much ink spilled on this over the ages. The seal does not itself mean that, okay, I'm Muhammad, that's it, no one comes at me, God has closed up shop, this is all there is. Okay, that's it. No such implication. In fact, until the middle of the Abbasid period, this specific issue was not properly resolved. And so there was no consensus in the Muslim community of the time that what Khatam al-Nabi'in meant was the literal end of all prophecy. And much of the evidence to that, besides the literary and intellectual, the evidence to that is that these first 250 years of Islamic history's existence was the period where you had an infinite array of schismatic movements emerge from within the heart of Islam, with its leaders making claims similar to the claims of the Prophet Muhammad. Many of them were put down, usually, but not always. Some of these were, the various Shiite splint-off groups and whatnot. So that means that within the community at large, including amongst many of its scholars at that time, at the early time, this idea was not a settled matter in the way that the Abbasids settled it. It is only when we get the production of the Hadith literature, which in itself is a late production, it's right, this, whether you're talking about the Sahih Bukhari from the Sunnis, their big, massive compendium of Sunni Hadith, this was all put together in the first few generations of the Abbasid Caliphate. Despite the claim that this was all put together during the early Umayyad period, there's no evidence to that at all. This was the codification of that Sahih Bukhari occurs within the first, the fifth generation of the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate. So, and this goes also for the Shiites, and especially with the 12er Shiites, what we find is that for every sacred cow that is codified by the Sunnis, the 12er Shiites turn around and do the same thing. For a simple reason is because the Shiites, and especially the Imamis, as one of many of the Shiite groups operating at the time, were always suspect by the majority. So they were always being called heretics, this, that, and their ideas were kooky and esoteric, and this stuff is all shirk in the eyes of the Sunni majority. So from around about the 10th century moving forward, the Twelver Shiites themselves start to buckle down and just starting to meet the Sunnis halfway on almost everything, to the point that most of the early books of Shiite hadith no longer even exist. Kulaini and all of that stuff that is now, basically the standard text of Shiite hadith are late productions. They're not the early Shiite books at all. But we still have some elements of these early Shiite books that occasionally crop up here and there. There's one belief, for example, that the Alawites and the Nusayris may contain some elements of these early Shiite, 12 Shiite beliefs that were kind of kept and were not destroyed, and so on and so forth. So, and as the scholarship now is beginning to prove, what happens in the first 200 years of Islamic history is, the beliefs that people had at that time is unlike anything that people take for granted as being the mainstream orthodoxy of Islam.
Do you think it would have been more dangerous to be a free thinker in the first 200 years or later?
It was dangerous, but yet you had such a prevalence of it at that time, that, whether it was dangerous or not was kind of a secondary thing because it was happening constantly. But today, because of this formulated consensus that everybody has kind of latched onto, and that you don't, under the threat of death, you don't, kind of push too hard against it. This consensus now is one, item, an article of faith that is very difficult to dislodge from the majority of Muslims. Even many of them who see the situation for what it is, agree if you try to logically, put all of this in front of them on the historically contextualize it, but even still, this is a identity. So then there's another problem here, and that problem is that Islamicity in our time has become a mere identity. It has not become submission to Allah subhanahu. It has become just an identity, right? And this in itself is a form of shirk. Because the ultimate goal of all of this, the Quranic message is God. Period. It's not anything else.
Which, again, is the same situation with Judaism and Christianity, which is why they're all still at each other's throats constantly, and why there probably always will be till they get over this hump, if that's even possible. Like, to get over a hump like that, because that hump might be built into the fabric of well, I don't know. I don't really know. It's hard to imagine it.
I keep going back to that great saying of Ali alayhi salam, knowledge is a single point that the ignorant have multiplied. And this is really the story of religion. That single point, it always remains the single point. But the multiplications in the religion is this is an evidence of the jahl of humanity, of the ignorance of humanity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that the fundamentalist kind of movements that have happened in the last 150 years is partially a reaction to colonialism?
That's part of the story. I think in the Muslim world, it's definitely to some extent that, but this theory also then needs to explain, the popularity of a figure in the late medieval period, like in Ibn Taymiyyah, who was completely excoriated during his own time, considered a heretic by even most of the most lockjaw Sunni, jurisconsulates of his time. But yet it is mainly his ideas amongst the Sunnis that have been kind of appropriated and used as the basis and the substrate to a lot of these fundamentalist and Islamist movements in our time.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, if you can pivot back to the
Sure.
metaphysics.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just trying to get clear on some of the details of this whole idea of this flowing, moving nature. Well, first of all, like I couldn't exactly figure out I didn't know exactly what distinction he was making between his own position and the other one,
Yeah.
where he says the emergence and passage from potency to actuality is an abstract notion in the mind, but then he says that there's this true motion through which each being is continually renewed and emerges from potency to actuality. So he still thinks that this motion involves that moving from potentiality to actuality. That's still a part of it.
Mhm.
But is it just the point that this is taking place in wujud and not in mahia, and that the people in the past, the peripatetics, were thinking of movement as taking place in a concept or an equity?
Yeah, the peripatetic notions, at least with some of the Islamic peripatetics before Mulla Sadra, they believed that some sort of motion was happening in liquidity itself. Whereas what Mulla Sadra just told us is essentially the point of view of Ibn Arabi's immutable archetypal essence, because these things don't possess real essential existence, right? The suchness of something is not something that you can point out and say, that's it, right? Because it's constantly undergoing this alteration from moment to moment to moment to moment. It's being subjected to this renewed creation, the tajdid al. So what is that suchness other than an intelligible, which is basically what Mulla Sadra is saying. So the quiddity of everything, by virtue of that suchness, is in a sense a fiction. Right? We read this in Ibn Arabi in regards to the minimal archetypal essence and the nature of the names and their relations, etc. And he's saying that this notion abides even about the individual, and it's a very valid point because, for example, we take any individual, isolate that individual, right? At which point in time in the evolution of that individual do we point out and say that is the quiddity of that individual? That's impossible. That quiddity is either, all of that individual, right? So if it is every point periodization of that individual, by periodization, we mean that every single moment that individual is undergoing, growth, generation and corruption in the world of matter, that what do we point out as its quiddity, as its mahiyya? So it is that identity, that huwiyya of that individual that is forever undergoing that transubstantial motion, with the quiddity of that person being intelligible in the mind of God about that person. So the Hussainness of Hussein is that intelligence. But Hussein's huwiyya is what is from the moment of conception to the moment of the exodus to the other side, is forever undergoing this transformation in that transubstantial motion, which, as I mentioned, as he himself is kind of articulating, has there is that inherent presential, divine imprint within that Hussainness already, that is making this thing, that huwiyya, move from one point to another, and so on and so forth, or to be redirected completely somewhere else. One of the implications of what Mulla Sadra is saying here, which very few have kind of grasped, but the implication is there, is that the quiddity of something, or what God creates of the quiddity of any given thing, can potentially contain all of its opposites and alternatives simultaneously within it. Whether that thing, existentiates that alternative or opposite of itself or not. That's one of the implications of what Mulla Sadra just said to us.
So this is something that came up when we were discussing this in the Fasus course too. If there is an archetype in the mind of God, then can we think of that as somehow confining that that motion? Is it like the boundaries within which the motion of a particular thing take place?
As a secondary intelligible, if we, look at a boundary just as a strict kind of placeholder, the boundary or demarcation of each particular thing would be that quiddity of that thing, which is generated as the immutable essence in the mind of God. So it is this as opposed to something else, right? But what Mulla Sadra is telling us here is that even this thing is fluid. There's even a fluidity to that. So therefore, there's even a fluidity to what the mind would posit as being the boundaries of the quiddity of a given thing. Yeah. It's arbitrary, something that the mind wants to, because mind can only understand through had the definition of something. So if there is this absolute fluidity to this thing, then what Mulla Sadra is trying to do is for all of these concepts that he's deconstructing from philosophy, he's doing this deliberately to get people back to just fall back to some understanding, even on an axiomatic level, about the primacy of being itself. Stop thinking from these terms of, the definition to have the mahdud of any given quiddity itself. And then he's explaining why that is the case.
Well, then it seems like it would be the correct thing to do would be to always update one's concepts, because we talk about just in interpersonal relationships, it's like, oh, I'm not the person you think I am, right? But just with everything in existence, we could say that it would be necessary to always be updating our ideas about things.
Well, yes, but also simultaneously, we are also being updated from each moment. We are constantly being updated. But yeah, obviously on the Zahiri level, we should also be updating as well at every moment. Yeah.
And just a couple of other things to clarify about this. Is it right to say then that actualization is going on infinitely?
Yes.
Things don't go backwards. I think for Mulla Sadra, they just go from potentiality to actuality.
Yeah, perpetually. Yeah. Yeah.
So all of existence all of time is everything is always getting more intense.
Yes. Well, in a sort of way, or to put it another way, for example, if someone, actualizes a regress, that's still an actualization. You're not actually moving back. It's just that the form that the actualization manifests is a regressive one. But then that could also change. That regression can then actualize itself into something else, better or different from the former regression, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And then the last thing is, I don't know how this idea of a continual process. I don't think he's calling it a continual process. It's a discontinuous process. Is that right? It's the khalq jadid is that it's not motion in a linear sense, but it's motion in the sense that everything is being annihilated and then given existence again. And then
remember when in the Fusus al-Hikam, when Ibn Arabi was talking about creation at each moment, there was a poem that he quoted to try to explain what this recreation actually looks like. And he critiqued that poem when he said that the poet puts "and then," because with God in the recreation of the world, there is no "and then," right? Which then took away from us this category of trying to understand how this even manifests, if it's not in that kind of linear, from A to B, B to C, et cetera, et cetera. What Mulla Sadra is trying to put his finger on is sort of the same thing, except the way he is doing it is, rather than get us to deconstruct our notion of linear time, he's putting this transubstantiation inherent within each substance or in the universal substance itself as something that is inherent with it, that is going on continuously. You could take it linearly, or you cannot take it linear. You can take it non-linear. but this is what is going on, is what he's saying.
Okay, thank you.
What I like about this is that I see him taking creation out of time. We often look at creation as something that occurred back in time, and we are moving away from creation. And I see what's happening in this text is that essentially creation is every moment.
Yeah.
And essentially, you can take that logic a little further. Creation is eternal, is an eternal activity of Allah. Now, I know theologians might shit bricks about that,
Yeah. And
depending on who they are. But
yeah.
I think he's doing this though in a way where, because Allah is ultimately wujud, everything is still contingent upon Allah. We're not talking about a simplistic pantheism.
Yeah. No, you're 100 spot on. This is exactly what he's doing. He gets this from Ibn Arabi and basically augments this. His own teacher struggled with this idea, but rather than adopt the Akbarian point of view, because Mir Damad didn't like Ibn Arabi very much, comes at this from the Ishraqi Aristotelian perspective of atemporal origination, right? But what Mulla Sadra is doing, he's taking his teacher's concept of atemporal origination, but then, wedding it to the Akbarian notion of continual creation at each moment. But with one silver lining with Mulla Sadra is that Mulla Sadra is not having to adopt the atomist Asherite metaphysics to explain the occasionalist metaphysics of the Asherites to try to explain how this process works. So he's arguing the same thing as Ibn Arabi, but from the perspective of the Aristotelian category of the usia, the substance itself, which is, I think, what is extremely novel and good to get one's head around. Because with Ibn Arabi, you're still kind of thinking within that Asherite occasionalist template, which has its problems and confuses. But the way that Sadra kind of reformulates and recalibrates that gives us a much clearer picture of how this is supposed to be working.
What do you think is the chief problem of the Ashari occasionalism that this is directly solving?
Well, the Asherites have the problem of the vacuum. Okay, God is bringing into existence atoms and then destroying them and then renewing the creation with atoms. And the question always remains, well, what happens in that moment in between the creation and recreation of the atoms? We have a vacuum here, right? And Ibn Arabi kind of, in a paradox, sort of resolves that problem in the Futuhat and the Fusus. But with Mulla Sadra, we have an actual much better kind of gauge of how that possibility is, particularly in a very radical way that he reformulates the Aristotelian notion of the intellectia, the inherence. When he's talking, for example, in that section about the soul-body relationship in the world and the evolution of the soul as well as the body, all of these things kind of fill in the holes that we didn't get too much with Ibn Arabi. But it's the same concept, essentially. Yeah.
For, excuse me.
No problem.
The first thing which I struggle to understand that the distinction between the things which are other than God and things which are not other than God seems very artificial distinguishing for me. For example, let's say the material bodies or the souls on one side are considered to be things in some sense which are other than God. On the other side, the intellect, the pure intellect, and Mufaraqat al-Mahd, which are also mentioned, are not considered in some sense to be things other than God. Because in some perspective, everything could be considered that it is not other than God. Where is exactly the lining in the tooth of Mulla Sadra here in this chapter?
It all depends from the perspective of analysis. So if you're talking from the perspective of that term that the Akbarians love to use, the hadiyatul jam, right? The oneness inclusive of everything, then there is no other than God. But if you're talking from the tahlili, from the analytical point of view of trying to understand the relationship of things with the ultimate, then it's only from the perspective of analysis that we talk about, other than God. Okay, so that is probably the way to look at that particular issue. Yeah, because I mean, otherwise, then this creates a problem for the whole concept of the Salat al-Wujud itself. Yeah, I understand. But it's with these guys, and even with Ibn Arabi, it's just the perspective of analysis that we have to look at when we are saying one or the other statement. Yeah.
Okay, then the other things which seems a little bit counterintuitive for me, that if we say, for examples, okay, let's accept that material bodies and souls which are in some manner connected to material bodies have some kind of independent existence, then it would follow that let's say, the pure intellects are even more real than the material bodies. But
Yes, that's what he said. Yeah. The immaterial intellect. So from this perspective, right, you have to consider of the building block principles of what makes these bodies to be bodies at all, what animates them, right? And so as you move back from the body to the soul, from the soul to the spirit being the realm of the intellect, right? Or the higher intelligence, or however you want to denote that term, then yeah, these things become even more real. They have the reality. So your animation, your consciousness, everything is animate and conscious by virtue of these abstract intellects that occur beyond even the realm of your own soul.
okay, and another one, I want to make a little comparison between the conception of transubstantial motion of Mulla Sadra, which I understood the meaning is that the motion of everything in the nature, it is a result of its own essence, because
It is
God
what?
created
It is what?
its own essence,
Yeah.
because God created its own essence in such a way that it is very deep in its nature, that it is constantly flowing and constantly changing. And that explains absolutely everything, the motion of everything, regardless it is matter or soul or whatever else it is. And then the other kinds of motion, for example, motion in place or motion in the some of the accidents of the Jawhar, they are just a secondary result from the transubstantial motion. It is very well put, very beautiful. I like it. But on the other side, the Aristotelian scheme, I also see a beauty in it, where the rotation of the heavenly spheres, it is the intermediary between what is not changing, God on one side, and what is constantly in change, the sublunar world of material bodies. Because the symbolic itself, the sphere on one side, it is constant because it doesn't move in a place. It's just around
Itself.
about its center. Yes, and it combines perfectly the motionless and the motion itself.
Yeah.
And taking it as a symbol, because if we take contemporary astronomy, physics, and so on, they will say that everything, even stars, spheres, have its origin in time, it is constantly changing, and so on. It will be more close to the explanation of Mulla Sadra. But uh, again, if we take it on more on symbolic level, where the basis of contemporary physics, it is mathematical principles, and these mathematical principles, then they are eternal, not changing. We are again rediscovering the Pythagorean scheme of the things. But here the intermediate world between the higher metaphysics and the material reality would be the principles of mathematics, that this is which I find in the symbolic of the rotation of heavenly spheres.
Yeah, I mean, if as a symbol, it's wonderful. But I mean, yeah, if we take it literally, then the problem is what you just put your foot, because these things, from the point of view of modern science, are constantly undergoing their own change, themselves. But yeah, as a symbol of the unmoved, the sphere being, the unmoved mover is a perfect symbol. Why the Aristotelians came up with it, precisely from their observation of these celestial spheres. But from an ontological point of view that Mulla Sadra is trying to establish, that symbol itself has problems if we contemplate it merely from that point of view. Number one, because even though it's a sphere and it's the perfect shape, we're still projecting on ontology a kind of a mahia kind of, and what Mulla Sadra is attempting to do is kind of move us away from these kinds of conceptions about being itself, to try to articulate it in that kind of way, to then maybe experience the immediacy of being itself. Because one of the things that this conception of quiddity seems to do to notions of God is to make it ever more transcendent, but in a spatial sense rather than in a qualitative sense. We can have a qualitatively absolute transcendent Godhead while having it completely immanent at the same time. What? Because it is qualitatively transcendent, not from the point of view of spatial quantity. And no matter how refined this language of the primacy of quiddity gets with a lot of these philosophers, including with someone as great as Sheikh Ahmad al-Sa'id, they cannot quite get their categories totally aligned to articulate that transcendence does not necessarily is not in all cases synonymous with spatial distance at all. Transcendence can just mean that something is so alien in its qualitative reality to what is in front of us that that there is no imminence of comparisons between us and it, rather than it being spatially so far away somewhere in a distant, galaxy somewhere else, right? This is the problem with the primacy of quiddity. even when it refines its concept, it cannot get its head around this problem. Whereas with the primacy of being, God can be as radically transcendent as you want to be, but it's also immanent in that radical transcendence simultaneous as well, because we're talking about a qualitative transcendence and a qualitative immanence simultaneous.
Yes, what you have said that the quiddity, it is trying to, in some sense, we are taking snapshot of the reality by the head, by the definition of the very thing. But the idea is to get the whole process, which is constantly changing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Nate, did you want to say something before we go?
Oh no, I'm good, Wahid.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, let's finish this first part for next week. So just read 14, 15, and 16. These are short. And we'll then finish part 1 for next week. And I hope everybody has a good week. Until next week, same time, Yallah.